I'd like to move on to the next topic now, which is about how many genders there are.
Today is there are only two genders. Change my mind.
How many genders are there?
I don't know. I just got here.
The fact that there are only two genders.
There are a few genders on the list that I agree with, though. Maybe not a few, but a couple. Also, if you expect fact-checking and research, you know me better than that by now.
Just let me know how many genders you think there are.
How many are there?
36. Counted them myself.
36! But last year I had 37!
Yes, well, some of them are quite a bit bigger than last year.
I don't care how big they are!
Whom among us has not run into a SJW cringe compilation or some bizarre crypto-fascist channel going on and on about this very question? In this essay, we'll be exploring how there are exactly 36 genders. I counted them myself. Liberal arts colleges are typically depicted as some kind of degenerate parallel universe of deluded cosplayers by major right-wing media outlets. And the crux of that is often the fabled gender studies degree, which makes you a pathetic mewling barista by day and a dangerous postmodern neo-Marxist by night. I'm not here to defend all liberal arts schools or the degrees they hand out. My finance degree, for example, is mostly nonsense. But the study of race, gender, and religion, not merely as a collection of consciousnesses, but as real political movements and economic interests, is a vital part of understanding political science, economics, and history. In this essay, I will lay out a leftist conception of gender using the lens of history and real material scientific evidence. This view will be contrasted with the far-right tradcon alt-right view of gender as some immutable metaphysical concept, and the more moderate right-wing view of gender vis-a-vis liberalism, donut Twitter, and the legendary SJW identitarian. Yes, there are ample SJW elements that are right of center and that they fail to interrogate capitalism. Just wait for it. I couldn't always find recordings of people pronouncing some of the words in this section, so I apologize in advance for not really being able to do that. In order to understand gender as more than merely ideology or taxonomy, it will be useful to have an example of gender as a tangible material historical force. Let's start with a clear example of how gender functions not just as a personal experience, but as a hegemonic project, a means of domination, exploitation, and even elimination. In her essay, Kill the Winyan and Save the Woman, Settler Colonialism and Gender, Hinska Hanska describes the gender roles of the Oceti-Shaukoin people, or Seven Council Fires. The writer, at Andrea Lakota on Twitter, is a Lakota Wingte. Quote, "The last time I came out to a non-native friend as Wingte, she asked me what that meant. I told her that Wingte was one of the 4 genders that we have among Lakota people, where a person born Wichasa decides that they are going to partially comply with the social roles of Winyan, but that they are truly neither Wichasa nor Winyan because Wakan Thangka gave them a spirit distinct from both, and they have their own social roles that, although leaning towards those of Winyan, are different." Her eyes immediately began to glaze over. "Basically, I'm a trans woman," I told her. That she understood. End quote. One of the problems settler colonists encountered in trying to subsume the people of Oceti-Shaukoin is that they were living in a kinship-based communistic mode of production. There were sex-based social roles, but they were not so rigidly enforced. There were 4, not 2, and people could choose which social role to comply with and which division of labor they would take up. For this reason, colonists sought not merely to proletarianize indigenous peoples, but to eliminate them. Quote, "It is clear to those who have properly studied the history of nations occupied by settler-colonial entities that the entirety of class struggle is based upon the struggle of mode of production." End quote. As such, it becomes necessary to undermine the gender roles of indigenous people not just culturally but materially. What constitutes Winyan is not the same as what constitutes a proletarian or feudal woman in a global north settler context. Quote, "This system seeks to completely eliminate any ability to express Winyanness and to substitute that gender for that of woman. The elimination of Winyan comes in multiple ways. The first is the imposition of imperial capitalism upon Oceti-Shaukoin people. No longer able to function within a kinship-based mode of production, our genders have their material basis in which they function taken away from them. The second way in which Winyan is eliminated is through cultural means. If a Winyan is raised in a society where she is taught to be a woman, the goal is to eliminate the indigenous gender role and to replace it with a cisgender settler woman's role. The surface goal of this is to make Oceti-Shaukoin Winyan into productive members of the imperial capitalist economy and society. Making women into women allows them to participate in the reproduction of capitalism until the settler state completes its ultimate goal of eliminating all indigenous people. The ultimate objective of this is to eliminate indigeneity in general, and to legitimate the settler society which has been built on indigenous land. In summary, we could take the famous phrase, kill the Indian and save the man, and make it kill the Winyan and save the woman. End quote. The social aspects of hegemonic projects exist to make the losers of hierarchy easier to manage. The political projects exist to cultivate and entrench extraction and exploitation. The economic basis of hegemonic projects is always a something-for-nothing type of bargain. Slavery, sweatshops, stolen resources, etc. Let's examine some of the political aspects of how settler colonialism eradicated indigenous lifeways vis-a-vis gender in order to control the population, exploit it, and ultimately erase it. I'm going to have to use the terms man and woman somewhat inappropriately to describe this, as dozens, if not hundreds, of distinct cultures were collapsed by the legislation described into singular settler colonist ideals. Calling someone a man or a woman when describing genocidal projects designed to make them into global north ideas of a man or a woman is confusing. I'll be speaking about the Canadian context. Quote, "The Indian Act, created by the federal government in 1876, was evidently designed with the colonial ideal of men as leaders and heads of households, and women as dependents of their husbands. The Indian Act denied women the right to possess land and marital property. Only widows could possess land under the reserve system." End quote. Whatever social or political role these individuals occupied beforehand was almost certainly not structured in this way. Quote, "The federal government imposed the band structure as a new form of aboriginal government to eradicate traditional hereditary leadership and facilitate federal influence and control. Band governments were created as strictly male domain, with women unable to become chiefs or band counselors. Women, who previously were key decision makers and advisors, were now completely excluded from decision-making in their own communities." End quote. No property, except as access through a settler colonist idea of a father or husband. No political representation. This is what it meant to be a woman, not what it meant to be a female-bodied member of these societies previously. Quote, "Over the years, more and more women were being thrown out of their homes by husbands, while the men then moved their girlfriends, often non-status, into the family home. The Indian women and children had to move into condemned houses or in with relatives who already were overcrowded. Since the Indian Act gave men sole ownership of property through certificates of possession, women had no housing rights or recourse to help through the law." End quote. Eventually, the government decided that only indigenous men, their children, or their wives were Indians at all, thus making this new class of women totally reliant on their relationships with men to determine whether or not they were Indians at all, and entitled to any of the limited rights and protections still afforded Native women. This is a classic settler-colonial tactic. The State of Israel, for example, controls the population register for the Gaza Strip. Recently, the murders and disappearances of indigenous women and girls in Canada has been deemed a genocide. The genocides in the Americas show how a Western European conception of gender was forced upon Native Americans as a form of control and extermination. But how did this conception of gender come to exist in the first place? I mentioned in my essay on the bell curve that wages in Western Europe peaked after the Black Death. The deterioration of the labor supply gave the workers and peasants who survived a level of bargaining power they had never possessed before. The ruling classes at the time sought to divide the lower classes against each other, in the same way that they do even now, by obscuring class relations through appeals to social layers. This section draws heavily from Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. Quote, "However, by the end of the 15th century, a counter-revolution was already underway at every level of social and political life. First, efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex, and turned class antagonism into an antagonism against proletarian women. As Jacques Rousseau has shown in Medieval Prostitution, in France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, provided the victims were women of the lower class." End quote. This is very reminiscent of ISIS. Beyond relaxing restrictions on rape, prostitution was also legalized and elevated to the level of a state institution or even a public service, a classic bread and circuses ploy, using women's bodies. Quote, Another aspect of the divisive sexual politics that the princes and municipal authorities pursued to diffuse workers' protest was the institutionalization of prostitution, implemented through the opening of municipal brothels soon proliferating throughout Europe. Enabled by the contemporary high-wage regime, state-managed prostitution was seen as a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth, who in Le Grand Maison, as the state brothel was called in France, could enjoy a privilege previously reserved for older men. The municipal brothel was also considered a remedy against homosexuality, which in several European towns was widely and publicly practiced, but in the aftermath of the Black Death was beginning to be feared as a cause of depopulation. End quote. Indeed, as the book's title would suggest, even the obsession with heretics and witches, widely believed to be the product of naked ignorance and superstition, was deeply tied to political economy. Quote, "Let us recall here Frederick Engels' distinction between the heretical beliefs of peasants and artisans, associated with their opposition to feudal authority, and those of the town burghers, that were primarily a protest against the clergy." End quote. As just one example, quote, "The Bogomils were for the Eastern Church what the Cathars were for the Western. Aside from their Manichaeanism and antinatalism, the Byzantine authorities were most alarmed by the Bogomils' radical anarchism, civil disobedience, and class hatred. As Presbyter Cosmas wrote in his sermons against them, they teach their own people not to obey their masters. They revile the wealthy, hate the king, ridicule the elders, condemn the boyars, regard as vile in the eyes of God those who serve the king, and forbid every serf to work for his lord." The heresy had a tremendous and long-term influence on the peasantry of the Balkans. The Bogomils preached in the language of the people, and their message was understood by the people. Their loose organization, their attractive solution to the problem of evil, and their commitment to social protest made their movement virtually indestructible. The influence of the Bogomils on heresy is traceable in the use, common by the 13th century, of buggery, to connote first heresy and then homosexuality. End quote. Right-wing populism never changes, does it? Dividing the lower classes against themselves was a necessary aspect of maintaining feudal order, but these tactics only accelerated with the rise of the burgeoning capitalist class. In order to gain more proletarians, it was necessary to throw as many people off the land as possible, to dissolve the rights and protections of the peasants and serfs. This is something that Marx noted. However, the main process of accumulating more workers cannot remain throwing people off their land or enslaving them. It will eventually come to sexually exploiting working women. Federici lays out her insights thus. Quote, 1. The expropriation of European workers from their means of subsistence and the enslavement of Native Americans and Africans to the mines and plantations of the New World were not the only means by which a world proletariat was formed and accumulated. 2. This process required the transformation of the body into a work machine and the subjugation of women to the reproduction of the workforce. Most of all, it required the destruction of the power of women which, in Europe as in America, was achieved through the extermination of the witches. 3. Primitive accumulation, then, was not simply an accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital. It was also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, whereby hierarchies built upon gender, as well as race and age, became constitutive of class rule in the formation of the modern proletariat. 4. We cannot, therefore, identify capitalist accumulation with the liberation of the worker, female or male, as many Marxists, among others, have done, or see the advent of capitalism as a moment of historical progress. On the contrary, capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, as it has planted into the body of the proletariat deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. It is in great part because of these imposed divisions, especially those between women and men, that capitalist accumulation continues to devastate life in every corner of the planet. End quote. Right-wing populism is the unholy alliance of bigots and billionaires, of capitalists and the KKK, and this is no accident. The social layering of society vis-a-vis race, gender, nationality, religion, and so on is a necessary social condition for the maintenance of class distinction. Any functional left populism must therefore comprehend these social layering projects, not just culturally, but in their historical and material contexts. A failure to do so is to render ourselves incapable of undoing or changing them. We saw in the previous section how settler colonists made indigenous women dependent on men. Western Europe tells the same story. Freeing of land severed it from its traditional use as a means of subsistence, allowing it to be used for accumulation. This broke the unity of productive and reproductive labor. Quote, with the demise of the subsistence economy that had prevailed in pre-capitalist Europe, the unity of production and reproduction, which has been typical of all societies based on production for use, came to an end, as these activities became the carriers of different social relations and were sexually differentiated. In the new monetary regime, only production for market was defined as a value-creating activity, where the production of the worker began to be considered as valueless from an economic viewpoint, and even ceased to be considered as work. Reproductive work continued to be paid, though at the lowest rates, when performed for the master class or outside the home. But the economic importance of the reproduction of labor power carried out in the home and its economic function in the accumulation of capital became invisible, being mystified as a natural vocation and labeled women's labor. In addition, women were excluded from the many waged occupations and, when they worked for a wage, they earned a pittance compared to the average male wage. End quote. Here, Federici's analysis mirrors the analysis of Hinska Hanska, who noted that undermining the material base of a people is necessary for forcing new gender divisions into it. The state now could leverage the male wage in order to control women's labor. The previous feudal paradigm of weak labor, whereby a serf would work X number of days of the week on the lord's land, was replaced with wages. Here, the exploitation and the rate of exploitation is obvious. No one needs an education to know that working 2 days out of 7 for a lord means 2/7 of your labor is going to the lord. It now takes millions of computations to figure out how much the workers get to keep. The OECD puts it at around 55 to 60%. Quote, the separation of workers from their means of subsistence and their new dependence on monetary relations also meant that the real wage could now be cut, and women's labor could be further devalued with respect to men's through monetary manipulation. It is not a coincidence, then, that as soon as land began to be privatized, the prices of foodstuffs, which for 2 centuries had stagnated, began to rise. End quote. Federici obviously has a lot more to say, but this is a general outline of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Western Europe. The goals of the aristocrats and capitalists were hidden within social roles and religious traditions. Men were divided against women, and women were made dependent on men economically. We'll explore the implications of the severance of productive and reproductive labor in the next section. In this section, I'll be drawing from the works of Paul Cockshott, a Marxist economist. Quote, neither feudalism nor slavery, even less capitalism, no such regulating and correcting built-in mechanisms governing the process of reproduction. On the contrary, in the last analysis, we find that all modern models of production, all classes of societies depend, for the supply of labor power, on the domestic community. End quote. Perhaps this is the reason why, as Engels noted, marriage is a rather late historical invention. Private property, especially accumulation economies, also happens to be a late historical invention. Recall Hinska Hanska's description of the communistic mode of production of the Lakota, and Federici's observation that feudalism was a for-use economy versus the accumulation economy of capitalism. We can see how these express themselves in the sphere of reproduction and of sexuality. The reproductive sphere of the Lakota was for use, but that isn't quite true of patriarchalism. Quote, inside the domestic economy there is, Delphi argues, a class antagonism between patriarchs on the one side and on the other side wives and to an extent older children. The patriarchs exploit their wives and children. The wives and children provide labor which yields goods which are partly consumed on the farm and partly sold on the market. The property relations ensure that the product from the sales of these commodities belong to the male head of household. In addition, the patriarchs typically did fewer hours work a week than their wives. End quote. The reproductive sphere of patriarchalism is an accumulation reproduction. This is the sexuality of accumulation, although women in many of these societies had more rights than even in some capitalist societies of today. Quote, children remain necessary to society, and as a future source of labor power, they are an obvious necessity for employers. But the family now raises them in what amounts more to a social duty conditioned by ideological expectations than an internal economic necessity. The inevitable consequence of this has been a decline in family size, a falling birth rate. End quote. The going rate of a surrogacy is about $40,000 to $50,000, and it costs about $250,000 to raise a child to adulthood. The typical American worker produces millions of dollars worth of surplus in their lifetimes, and whereas once this would go to the patriarch, and then to the inheriting children, it now accumulates in the hands of the ownership classes, which once included peasant men. Note something very important here. Workers are exploited in the sphere of production and reproduction, but working class women are doubly exploited in the sphere of reproduction, once as workers, and again as women. The productive sphere has been socialized, in that we all work together, but the reproductive sphere has not been. Often, it is noted that enclosure acts, slavery, and colonialism work to increase the labor supply, but this is only partly accurate. Proletarian, enslaved, and colonized women are transformed into doubly exploited work machines, the only source of new subjects. Quote, once the latent reserve starts to be exhausted, real wages have to rise to fully cover the cost of reproducing labor power. Kaczynski argued that it was not until almost a century after the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain that this stage was reached in the 1870s. End quote. I noted in a previous essay that there was no appreciable standard of living increase within British capitalism until after 1850, so this fits rather nicely with that. The last thing here to note is that this double exploitation in the reproductive sphere helps to explain nearly all of the wage gap between the sexes. Look at the breakdown of labor time. Quote, for men it divides 3 to 2 in favor of the market economy, whereas for women the ratio of market to domestic is only 2 to 3. End quote. Liberals often focus on cultural factors, and these are still important. Combating prejudice always is. The analysis afforded us by classical political economy, however, gives us different insights. Quote, as the women's share of the workforce rises, their wage rate as a percentage of men's wages rises. In fact, the correlation between the two series is 90.9%. That means that only 9.1% of the change in the wage gap needs to be explained by other factors, for instance, union membership. End quote. People who wish to deny the gender wage gap often do so by saying this all comes down to choices. These are also the people who mock the idea that someone assigned male at birth could choose to be a woman because women, of course, have functioning wombs. We'll discuss some other cases later, but generally speaking, only women can bear children. The right is often very hostile to anything that allows women to choose not to do this. But even if they supported sex ed, contraception, abortion access, and all the rest, what would be the result of reproduction within capitalism? Mothers are going to have to miss at least some work to have children. In an age of precarity, this often means losing a job, but even if it didn't, who is going to make more money? Someone who missed a month of work or someone who didn't? Who is the rational capitalist going to promote or invest training into? Men are simply the safe bet for capitalists who must maximize profit, whether they are personally misogynist or not. The majority of working people live paycheck to paycheck. So if one person in a couple has to miss work, who is it going to be? It's going to be whomever makes less money. The person who missed work, missed out on a promotion, etc. is going to be the person who makes less money. So it just compounds. How are working women supposed to ever have the same economic power as working men if reproductive labor is not paid? If they don't have the same economic power, then how can they have equal political power? When all is accounted for, the rate of exploitation for women is much, much higher than it is for men. And the economic incentives to keep it that way are a pillar of capitalism, worth trillions a year. We can try to develop artificial wombs, but that's a ways off. Until then, a proper economic analysis is only the first step to equality for the sexes. There is a liberal tendency to conceptualize gender as a personal experience. Now, no one is, out of the blue, identifying with the desire to live off the fat of the land and take up weaving, but up to this point, the reason why sex-based divisions of labor have arisen, especially in accumulation societies, has been explained well enough economically. What remains is to question why people accept this paradigm at all. Why do people identify with these norms? Even enjoy them? These phenomena cannot simply be dismissed as purely social constructs. In his takedown of Judith Butler, Paul Cockshott remarks offhandedly that the sort of studies necessary to falsify some of Butler's claims would be extraordinarily unethical. It is with a heavy heart that I must inform you that our society is thoroughly unethical, and I have some studies. Throughout the 90s, William G. Reiner and John P. Gearhart studied 16 genetic male subjects with cloacal exstrophy. Quote, Cloacal exstrophy is a rare, complex defect of the entire pelvis and its contents that occurs during embryogenesis and is associated with severe phallic inadequacy, or phallic absence, in genetic males. For about 25 years, neonatal assignment to female sex has been advocated for affected males to overcome the issue of phallic inadequacy, but data on outcome remain sparse. End quote. It often requires reconstruction of the bladder and other organ systems of the pelvis. To be clear, yes, it was clinically recommended to raise people as girls just because their dicks were too small. I am not making this up. I promise, if you read this study, no matter what your views on sex or gender, it will nauseate and/or anger you to see how some of these parents treated their children. Moving on. Quote, they assessed all 16 genetic males in their cloacal exstrophy clinic at the ages of 5 to 16 years. 14 underwent neonatal assignment to female sex socially, legally, and surgically. The parents of the remaining 2 refused to do so. Detailed questionnaires extensively evaluated the development of sexual role and identity as defined by the subject's persistent declaration of their sex. End quote. I will pause briefly to allow you to guess the results. How many of these people eventually identified as men? Are you ready? Quote, 8 of the 14 subjects assigned to female sex declared themselves male during the course of this study, whereas the 2 raised as males remained male. Subjects could be grouped according to their stated sexual identity. 5 subjects were living as females, 3 were living with unclear sexual identity, although 2 of the 3 had declared themselves male, and 8 were living as males, 6 of whom had reassigned themselves to male sex. All 16 subjects had moderate to marked interests and attitudes that were considered typical of males. Follow-up ranged from 34 to 98 months. End quote. In their study on 5-alpha reductase deficiency in genetic males, Imperito McGinley et al. Found that, quote, in the formation of male gender identity, normal T exposures of the brain in utero and at puberty are major contributing factors. Thus, in normal males, the formation of gender identity is at least partially androgen-induced. End quote. Which would help to explain why, quote, a majority of genetically male children who have been, without their knowledge, raised from birth as girls because they did not have a penis, due to botched circumcision or the non-intersex condition cloacal exstrophy, eventually come to identify as boys and men, despite their gender socialization to the contrary. End quote. Whereas genetic males with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome almost always identify as women. Indeed, in CAIS cases, these individuals usually identify as heterosexual women, whereas in the cloacal exstrophy cases, those who identified as men were mostly heterosexual men. When discussing gender, it is necessary to consider biology, history, political science, and economics. Let's solidify this theory. Behold the diagram. This is mostly a jumping off point, but let's discuss. Within the means of reproduction category, there is genetics and biology, mirroring Federici's analysis of the body as a work machine. These are necessary for human reproduction, alongside various fertility technologies. Things like IVF, but also things like birth control. Other things must also be considered. The food must be preserved or prepared, clothing must be washed, tools must be sanitized, etc. Here we have the domestic technologies. Washing machines, ovens, freezers, and so on. We also have the relations of reproduction, where we must consider whether these fertility and domestic technologies are publicly or privately held. This heavily determines the labor divisions that arise, or even if they arise at all. A society with widely available birth control and abortion services, with a large number of artificial wombs, and where the majority of cooking and cleaning is done in public spaces for pay, would have a radically different social layering from our own. Quote, basically, there are 3 ways that women's workload in the home can be reduced. 1. A larger share of housework has to be done by men. 2. The productivity of labor in these tasks has to rise. 3. The same tasks have to move out of the domestic economy. End quote. This moves us to the superstructure, where ideology dwells. As Cockshott notes in his first point, it is possible to achieve a totally different division of reproductive, and thus productive, labor without any material changes to society vis-a-vis fertility or domestic technologies, or means of production for that matter. This can be achieved totally socially or politically, although the possibilities are still limited by nature and our relations to it, i.e., our technologies. Note that this is the place where right-wingers argue over sex and gender. Liberals hardly ever leave the superstructure, and when they discuss laws or construct political projects, they only have limited impact on the base. Birth control, abortion access, food stamps, etc. Gender isn't merely personal experiences, the media narratives normalizing them, or the legal institutions formalizing them. Gender is a set of economic interests and the mass political projects shaping and maintaining them, reaching down through the sexual division of labor and into the bodies of the lower classes themselves. Let's explore how two major gender projects shaped the 20th century. Red gender. The sexual politics of the USSR. Everyone in the US remembers Rosie the Riveter, an icon of propaganda meant to encourage women into the traditionally male field of heavy industry and manufacturing as a result of the World War II era total war economy. The USSR, on the other hand, was arguably operating within the space of a total war economy for the majority of its existence. Even so, the Soviets handled things in ways that were different from their Western rivals. Quote, "The Russian Civil War resulted in broad efforts to mobilize women as militant communists and to enlist in combat support positions for the Red Army. Although women played a predominantly secondary role in direct combat, during the Russian Civil War, the role of women in the Red Army as partisan fighters was sensationalized, romanticized, and celebrated by the Bolsheviks to encourage women to embrace communism." End quote. Don't forget, the last Tsar of Russia was ousted mostly by women in the February Revolution. The October Revolution was against a liberal provisional government that had reneged on its promises of getting out of World War I and engaging in land reform. This is just war, however, and Soviet women were encouraged to do more than take up arms as part of the revolution. Quote, "At a time when women's movements in the West limited themselves primarily to demands for a broader political enfranchisement of women, the fledgling Soviet government granted women full and equal political participation at all levels of government. Moreover, the Soviet regime, in addition, proposed a radical transformation of women's conditions of daily life, which would include the establishment of a broad network of social services designed to socialize women's household labor, the liberalization of marriage and divorce laws, and the setting up of affirmative action programs for the purpose of drawing women into government, political organizations, trade unions, factory management, and the professions and skilled trade. This was the most radical program for female equality advanced by any national government in modern times." End quote. The Soviet economy was a full employment economy that was hell-bent on transforming a peasant nation into an industrial power within the span of 2 5-year plans, first implemented in 1928. But the encouragement of women into the factories started even before the new economic program of state capitalism, during the era of war communism. Quote, "In 1922, women were 22% of the workforce, but within 10 years this figure had grown to 32%. Between 1922 and 1937, out of 4 million new workers, 82% were women." End quote. The Bolsheviks weren't just interested in Soviet women going to work, but also to war. Quote, "Soviet women went to the Eastern Front to fight against Germany and its Axis allies in direct combat roles that included bomber pilots, tankers, machine gunners, infanteers, and grenadiers. 800,000 women went directly to the Eastern Front, which was really a mere fraction of all those who volunteered and wanted to go. 520,000 of these women served as regular troops in the Red Army, while another 300,000 served in combat and anti-aircraft formation. By 1943, about 8% of Red Army personnel were women, which meant that almost 1 out of 10 people in uniform was a woman. And at World War II's end, in 1945, young women composed 70% of all young communist soldiers." End quote. Unfortunately, the grand Soviet vision of women's equality did not really come to pass. The Soviet Union was devastated by the war, losing tens of millions of people, the vast majority of whom were men. Quote, "In 1946, Soviet women outnumbered men by about 26 million." End quote. The Soviet economy was reduced by at least a fifth, even as the US economy expanded by half. With so many dead, and with the Industrial Revolution well apace, being a good citizen was heavily tied to being a mother for Soviet women. Mothers were afforded things like early retirements and stipends for having more children, something that could be found in Nazi Germany as well. Reproductive labor, however, remained uncompensated, and as no direct efforts were made by the state to re-socialize Soviet men into doing more of this domestic work, the burden of it fell, still, to women. Quote, however, more than 60 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet women continued to bear the major burden for household labor, and women have suffered the most from the government's long-term decision to give a low priority to consumers' goods and production. Lack of modern household appliances, the poor quality of meals in public dining rooms, and the scarcity, high cost, and inferior quality of basic necessities force women to labor many additional hours outside of their jobs to maintain their households. End quote. We can see how the same kinds of pressures within the planned economy of the USSR led to similar sorts of outcomes for women. The state planners focused on the accumulation of industrial equipment, leading them down the road of austerity for the reproductive sphere, where they hoped that domestic labor, mostly by women, would cover the shortfall of the public laundries, the dining halls, and the public daycares, despite Marxist orthodoxy with regards to centralizing things like this. A need to stabilize population decline led to attempts to compel more sexual labor from women, including changes to abortion laws. When the productive sphere becomes accumulationist, so does the reproductive sphere, and working women get hit twice over. The Night of the Trad Wives. The Sexual Politics of Fascism. The Nazis infamously portrayed Bolshevism as an insidious Jewish plot and scapegoated it for at least half of everything, the other half being the inter-imperial conflict Germany faced in World War I that stopped it from snagging more colonies, which was pushed by international financial institutions. Also an insidious Jewish plot. Naturally. They promised a respite from the hideous bourgeois decadence of British capitalism, which was very unlike the good German capitalism. British capitalism was exploitive and responsible for the suffering of the lower classes and of Germany. German capitalism, however, was patriotic, accountable, and class collaborationist. The Nazis also promised a halt to degenerate liberal social values, which they rebranded as cultural Bolshevism or Judeo-Bolshevism, today cultural Marxism. According to the Nazis, these social values sought to undermine the natural order as a means of destroying the nation from within. So, what did they actually do? Quote, it was a core Nazi belief that a woman's primary responsibility was to be at home looking after the children and the home. As such, the Nazis used a number of methods to encourage women to leave the workforce and focus on their families. End quote. This was during the Great Depression, so one of the main goals of the Nazis was to reduce unemployment. They achieved this through mass conscription, some public works projects, sending people who couldn't find jobs to work camps, and also sending women out of the workforce. Quote, women in certain professions such as doctors and civil servants were dismissed, while other married women were paid a lump sum of 1,000 marks to stay at home. End quote. The law for reduction of unemployment made women eligible for work only until the age of 35. It further discouraged women from working by offering them low-interest loans, which could be paid off by having children. They also had, places you could go to get knocked up by racially pure SS officers. I'm not making that up. Quote, this law did not have as significant of an impact as the Nazis predicted, and the employment of women only fell from 37% to 31% over the next 4 years. This was due in part to the fact that employers advocated against the law because women presented a much cheaper alternative to men. End quote. The actual force undermining the traditional patriarchal peasant family unit was the profit motive, not a shifty Jewish cabal. So killing all the Jews didn't actually have an effect on it. Even so, unemployment did drop. Building a gigantic military has that effect. Quote, by 1937, German unemployment had fallen from 6 million to 1 million. However, the standard of living for those in employment did not improve in the same way that it had done during the 1920s. With the Nazis controlling the trade unions, wage rates did not increase with productivity, and after a few years of Hitler's rule, workers began to privately question his economic policies. End quote. Given that the Nazi Party was literally funded by industrial capitalists, it's perhaps not surprising that the length of the working week increased, the trade unions were neutralized, profits exploded, and real wages actually declined. So, how did kicking women out of the workforce impact the upcoming total war economy? Quote, As World War II started and began to escalate, more and more men left their homes and jobs. Facing job shortages, the Nazis began to encourage women to fill the gap left by men. Young, especially single women, were eager to fill factory jobs even when faced with such blatant contradictions in policy. The Nazis were simultaneously promoting the idea of motherhood and the ideal German woman, whilst encouraging the filling of jobs to support the war effort. Because of this, the Nazis were unable to bring an adequate number of female workers back into the labor force. Only about 30% of women returned to employment during the war. End quote. Whoops. Well, at least they had those weird race brothels. The Nazis also utilized fewer women in their armed forces than the Soviets. Quote, female concentration camp guards, known as Aufseherinnen, numbered less than 0.7% of all guards. End quote. By the end of the war, only about 500,000 auxiliary members of the Wehrmacht were women throughout all the occupied territories. We see again how material economic conditions and political concerns shape gender. The Bolsheviks propagandized the romantic communist, revolutionary woman, taking up arms, industrializing the country, pursuing her PhD. The Nazis did the opposite, encouraging women in a bourgeois society back into the peasant patriarchal mold. Breaking this mold was a necessary aspect of the full employment, planned economy of the USSR. Recasting it was a necessary aspect of maintaining the high unemployment market economy of the Nazi Empire, where capitalists were either unwilling or unable to accept a New Deal paradigm. In 1920, Germany had half a century's head start on the industrialization process as compared to the USSR. One of the major components in closing this gap in the lead-up to World War II was the differing gender systems at play. Without this characteristic psychosexual obsession, perhaps the Nazis would never have come to power, or maybe they'd have won the Battle of Stalingrad. Who knows? It's impossible to separate the two halves of right-wing populism. In conclusion, I was going to analyze some right-wing cringe compilations or some videos of millionaire-funded media-trained conservative 30-somethings owning liberal teenagers, but I realized that I wouldn't really be analyzing any kind of theoretical framework, historical interpretation, or political economic argument. I'd just be looking at the rhetoric of some cynical bigots giving cover to their rich masters. I realize that's what draws people in, but I'll save that for another time. I also wanted to talk more about trans stuff, so maybe I'll kill two birds with one stone. In any case, I hope anyone watching this understands why leaving the question of gender at XX versus XY is silly and reductive. Gender isn't a singular aesthetic or the genetics that regulate that aesthetic. It's beyond even a medically complicated thing. It's about mode of production, division of labor, culture, politics, and everything else. It's not just what you look like, it's what you do, what is done to you, what you're told to be. When these various roles emerge, when they are created by exploiters, which one you're drawn to isn't going to be immediately obvious either. Gender can't be found in any single strand of DNA. There's no part of a person that can be unraveled to reveal whether they're going to be a hunter or a gatherer, or a desk jockey. Gender does not simply inhere in the individual. In many ways, it is as Marx said of the value of a commodity, immaterial, but objective, part of the society that created it, not of the commodity itself. The whole read a biology textbook argument reminds me so much of the bell curve, and that all of politics, history, and economics is supposed to be swept aside by a 6th grade understanding of genealogy. I hope I come to understand this all better in the future. If I do, I'll update all of this. In any case, thank you for your consideration.